You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
This is Celebs with Horses, highlighting celebrities from film, TV, the arts, and music, and their love of horses. Hosted by award-winning author, Lacy J.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Celebs with Horses, and many thanks to today's title sponsor, Hands On Gloves. I'm your host, Lacy J. People magazine described her gritty vocals as the country music equivalent of blues great Bonnie Raitt, and fans of country music will recognize her many hits, such as Takin' It Easy, Crazy Blue Eyes, and my favorite, 16th Avenue. Of course, we're talking today with Lacy J Dalton, who for decades has been an advocate for America's wild horses. Prior to her interest in the wild horse, Lacy spent decades wowing audiences with her mix of country, Americana, and Western music. Early in her career, she was honored as the Academy of Country Music's new female vocalist of the year. She's also a 3-time Grammy-nominated artist and the only woman featured on Willie Nelson's Half Nelson album. I have to think it must be pretty amazing when Willie Nelson chooses you to sing a duet with. Lacy's been inducted into the North America Country Music Association's International Hall of Fame and recently received the Pete Huttlinger Music Excellence Award from Strictly Country Magazine and the Spirit Awards. And last year, she received a Lifetime Career Achievement Award from the Josie Music Awards. Her songs and voice can also be heard in films, including the Allison Eastwood film, Don't Tell. But music aside, in 1999, after a tragedy that involved one of her favorite wild horses, Lacy co-founded the Let 'Em Run Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to rescuing, rehabilitating, and rehoming America's wild horses and burros who have no voice. It's an interesting journey that brought Lacy to the wild horse, and sometimes it's best to start at the beginning. So that's what I did when I asked her about her first memory of a horse.
Probably the very first memory would be one of those ponies that somebody brought around to have your picture taken on.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Actually, a better story. My grandfather worked for the railroad, and he had huge workhorses that he used to log. And he would drag these logs out of the woods and use them to make the railroad ties. He had, in his retirement, he always kept one or two of these wonderful, beautiful big horses around. And I was just fascinated with these horses. And I have a horrible story about, as a child, I knew where the grain bin was. So we must have fed one of those, thank God, very big horses 10 buckets of grain.
Oh, no!
We were about 7 or 8 years old, and my grandfather was furious. He was just furious. The horse lived, it was fine, but thank God, because he just loved him. But he had a knot in the manger of the horse's stall, and he always told us that if we could untie that knot, we could ride the horse. Well, of course, the knot was like the Gordian knot. There was no way you could untie the thing when you were 7. You couldn't even get your hand around it. But I had a lot of fun with my grandfather. He loved these horses. But he told me something that I'll never forget. He said, you must never trust a horse to kiss you on the face. Never trust a horse. He said, I had a horse that I loved and he loved me. And every day I would go in and he would kiss me on the cheek. And he said, one day he bit my cheek off.
Oh, no.
And my grandfather had this huge scar from where the horse had probably, they do that to play with each other and to, nipping each other to play. But these horses were huge. Their heads were, I mean, I don't know what their breeding was, but they were, it's been too long ago, but they were, when you were a little kid, they just towered above you. And I imagine if one of them took a bite out of your cheek, it was probably going to be that scar for the rest of your life.
Oh,
but that was a lesson. That was a lesson he taught us. Don't trust them that way.
Right.
Because they have a different way of showing their love than you do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Now, you went on obviously to have a huge career in music that's obviously still going very strong. And but at some point, you got involved with some wild horse advocacy. How did that come about?
Well, I've always loved horses. I've always thought horses were a very special animal. Um, and I've always thought they were one of the most beautiful animals. I love all animals, but horses are special to me. And it was probably in 1998 before I really got involved. We were down in Las Vegas, and I can't remember who all was there, but there were a lot of us stars that were there at the time. And the radio stations down there decided to help the Bureau of Land Management promote a big horse sale in Las Vegas. And to my knowledge, it was one of the most successful horse sales that ever happened. And we all, got on board and did PSAs, public service announcements for it. And so it was very, very successful. And that was sort of the beginning of the Bureau of Land Management beginning to attempt to get horses adopted out. That program has had some pretty wretched twists and turns over the years, but at least they're trying.
Yes. Yes. And so from there, something compelled you to get further involved and actually found a nonprofit to help the wild horses. What was that instigation?
Well, that is a sad story because I decided to move. I was in Nashville and I was very, very homesick for the West. I was born in northeastern Pennsylvania, but I ran off with a rock and roll guitar player when I was turning 21. We went out and lived in a commune, a hippie commune, and we had a psychedelic rock and roll band called Office. That we had, for lack of a better name, really, in fact. But we were. I lived in the Santa Cruz Mountains and near Santa Cruz, California, which is right over the hill from, where all the .com stuff is in the Silicon Valley. And it's very beautiful there. And it was very, it used to be a vacation place for a lot of the folks from San Francisco. And there were all these beautiful old cabins built in the 40s of heart redwood. And we got to live in those cabins. And there was an incredible music scene. I always tell people there were more musicians there than people. And that was really true. But when I got my record deal, the first time, I didn't have to go back to Nashville. They didn't, they said you can stay where you were. And I was so happy. But with my second record deal with Jimmy Bowen, he wanted me back in Nashville. And so I had to move back to Nashville. Now, having lived in the East before, I had already for many years realized that my spirit only felt right in the West. That was where my soul needed to be. There's something about the wide open spaces and the way people think, the kind of live and let live thing that's out here, really, really resonated with me. And so I was very, very, very homesick in Nashville. And finally, one day I said to my ex-husband, I said, I have to go back. I can't be here anymore. It's beautiful. I have the most beautiful farm I could ever imagine. I have everything I've ever wanted, but this is not where I'm supposed to be. I just know it. And so I began looking, and I looked it took me about 3 years of looking. But I had been playing all the big clubs in Reno, Nevada, Harrah's and the Nugget and the Peppermill and all those things for years. And I realized it was the biggest little city in the world. It had everything that you ever wanted in the city, but it was small. And I thought, this is a pretty nice town. It doesn't have a pretty clean face. At that time, it was pretty funky up here. It's become very much nicer now. But I started looking in the outlying areas, and I found a place up in the Reno sits in a deep valley,
right?
Called the Truckee Meadows, between the Sierras on the west and a smaller mountain range called the Virginia Range on the east. And up in that Virginia Range was the old town of Virginia City, which has is just exactly like it was 200 years ago. I mean, they just haven't gentrified it. It's a Western town that still looks like a Western town. It doesn't look like a movie set. And there's something about that I really liked. And so I decided that I might want to live up near Virginia City, up in the mountains here. And it took a long time to find the right house. One of the things that made me come here was I was sitting with my friend under a little place up in Virginia City, and we were having tea one night just about sunset. I'll just never forget. I said, "What am I hearing? What is that sound I'm hearing?" And she put her finger up in the air, and she said, "Listen, there's a horse coming." And I went out on the porch of her little Victorian house, and here was a little herd of wild horses, a little band of about 3 or 4 horses walking up E Street in Virginia City. Virginia City is just a village. It's really small. But I thought, if these horses can be here and be wild and free and walk up the street, maybe I can too.
Lacy did, in fact, settle in Virginia City and was proud to live in the state with the highest wild horse population in the country. Virginia City proved to be a charming town, and Lacy loved watching the many wild horses. She even became very fond of several of them. But when a tragic accident involved one of her favorite horses, the course of Lacy's life changed forever.
At that time, the house that I found, it was not uncommon for 30 or 40 horses to walk through the front of my land every day. And they show off their babies. And there was one very, very lovely bay stallion, very beautiful conformation. He had one white foot. And he threw all these little babies that looked just like him. And one day I took the road that comes into the Highland Ranches where I live out to the 2-lane road that goes down to Reno. And a lot of horses, there's a big straight stretch there. It's the only straight stretch. It's a switchback road that was built for the railroad that goes to Virginia City, but there's a straight stretch down below my house. And it's about a half a mile long, maybe a quarter of a mile long. And people really put on the gas there. And I'd seen so many horses killed on that corner. And one morning I went down, and that beautiful old stallion was there on the side of the road, and he had thrashed and had a horrible death.
Oh, how sad.
And, well, that was the moment. I called my friend and I said, "That's it. I cannot sit by, and these horses need their own place, and I need to do something, and I cannot sit by for one moment longer. This is the last time I want to see this."
Lacy was obviously heartbroken at the death of the little stallion, but she was also really mad. She's never been one to sit back, and now she decided it was the time to use her platform as a country music star to speak up and advocate for the wild horses of Nevada. Lacy spoke up loud and strong, and it wasn't long before several major companies began to listen.
In the subsequent years, I worked very hard with the largest industrial park in the world. There was a man who was the broker for that park, and his girlfriend was a famous Susan Austin, the
actress.
Well, actually, she was the madam of the whorehouse.
Oh my!
There, it's very famous. The Mustang Ranch and Wild Horse. In fact, when they built the new brothel, they named it for the wild horses.
Wow!
So they were very big help in talking the owner of that park into allowing the wild horse herd up here, which has been up here forever, about 2,500 horses usually. At least in past years, roamed these lands. And with where I live, the Highlands Ranches, there's about, and the industrial park and some other places where the horses are permitted to be, there's about 250,000 acres where the horses can roam. And we finally got permission. We talked the industrial park, the owner of the industrial park, into allowing those horses to be there because they didn't want them there. But I had read something in the Atlantic, I think I was in the Atlantic, that said, there are 3 reasons for moving international companies, moving their headquarters. One of them is I can't remember what the third one was, but one of them was proximity to wildlife. The second was proximity to a brothel. And the third one was, I don't know what, probably proximity to a big highway. But anyway, I took this article in and I was, pitching that. And it so happened that the first big company that came into the Tahoe Reno Industrial Park was Walmart. And the first thing they did after they moved in, they put up these huge water towers and painted wild horses all over them and gave us a donation to do some wild horse work. And that's when I think the owner of the park really realized that these horses could be a tremendous calling card for that industrial park, which is the largest one in the world. Then we had people come in like blockchains and Tesla, and they had interest in the horses, and now they are actually doing things to protect the horses. They're putting in water for them and fencing off highways and so on. So the horses are sort of just on that range, which is fine. They can be on that range all the time. There are mountains on that range, and there are also flatlands where they can graze in the winter.
Well, Walmart and Tesla are some pretty big companies, and before this interview, I had no idea they were involved with wild horses. There was a lot else I didn't know either, and when I began to research this episode, I found a lot of very passionate but very conflicting information on the internet about the wild horse. So I asked Lacy, in her opinion, what was the biggest misconception about these horses?
There is a persistent rumor that horses are not native to this country. Actually, in my wild horse museum, which I had for many years in Virginia City, we had the bones of the modern day horse found in the Pleistocene mud. Now, they probably did die out due to being eaten by the natives or the great mammal die-off, but they have been here in recorded history. Wildlife people would like to tell you that they are not native. I like to say to them, do you know what's not native to here? Cows and white people.
That's true.
Well, it is true. And the horses have been here. And in fact, they're finding a lot of bones of the horses that came from Norway up and around the Great Lakes. And the Lakota people had a completely different name. They say they have always had the horse. And their word for the horse is a completely different word than it is for the Mustangs that came from the Spanish that had, gotten away from the Spanish explorers and interbred. But they had a different word for their horse, and their horse looked very, very different. They were little scrubby things.
I love our hands-on gloves, especially because with them you can actually feel the horse as you groom. Really, they're absolutely amazing. Whether it's itchy bug bites, sticky sweat marks, caked on mud, or exuberant springtime shedding, hands-on gloves gives you the tactical tools you need to get the job done right. Hands-on gloves comes in pairs, so you'll get twice the work done in half the time. And since they are available in 3 different sizes, you get the gloves that work best for you. Plus, they come in a number of very cool colors. Hands-on gloves are available at major retailers nationwide or at handsongloves.com. And now, back to the show. As an author, I was fascinated to learn about the different words our Native Americans had for the horse, and after the interview, I got lost in the internet for a while reading about that. If you're interested, a simple Google search will turn up a plethora of information. And aside from the Native American words, the story Lacy told me next really spoke to my heart.
I've had some things that would be very hard if I told you for you to believe them. But the one thing we've noticed with the wild horse is that if we use those in programs where we are trying to help people that have post-traumatic stress syndrome, that the wild horses seem to bond a little differently than domestics.
Interesting.
It is interesting, and I think it's because of their fight and flight thing. But they are, I've had some things with these horses that have almost been metaphysical.
I'd love to hear about it.
Well, I'd say it's a little bit of a hard story to tell. I can tell you, but it's hard to believe, and it's a little hard to tell because I got this mare wild as a hare off the range, and she was miserable in my corral because she had something under her tail that was really bothering her. And she would go up to the fence and try to rub her tail on the fence, and I knew that she had some sort of fungus or something that was really bothering her. And I've found this with other horses and sometimes with people. Sometimes if you have a clear enough vision in your head of something that you want to do with an animal or with a person, and your vision is very clear, that not all of them seem to be able to do it as well. I think we all do it to a certain extent. We probably all do it all the time to a lesser extent than what I'm going to try to illustrate here. But this horse was miserable. And she had never been touched, and I couldn't get near her. She didn't. If I went in the corral, she would just, you'd raise your hand and she'd fly to the other side of the corral. She'd been frightened, and she was frightened of me. But I took a bucket of warm water out there, and I had some Furosin, which is I'm sure you know what that is. It's the best horse medicine on earth. If that doesn't fix it, you got to call the vet. But I had a pail of soapy warm water, and I put a picture in this mare's head. I said, back up to the fence and lift your tail up. And I just had this very clear picture. That horse backed up to the fence and put her tail up and allowed me to clean under her tail and then put Furosin under her tail. She only let me do it that day and the next day. But that actually happened. I think there is a sort of they're very sensitive animals, but I think some of them are pretty psychic.
Wow, I can only imagine how frightened that mare was, but I think many of us have had an experience like Lacy had, where it seemed as if we were communicating without words with our horse. And psychic or not, we all, like Lacy, strive to learn all we can from our horses.
They have so much to teach us. I think they teach us how to listen to them. And I think that the most important thing for us is to try to learn to listen to each other. And I think we don't listen as much as we want to be heard. And I know that's true. I'm always trying. I like to talk. So it's very important for me to also be quiet and really listen to what people and animals have to say, because there's a certain oneness in all things that are. And if you can get to that point of quiet and stillness where you're listening and paying attention, it's easier to feel that link between other people and animals and yourself. I think horses and animals teach us that.
In addition to being great teachers, we all know that horses can provide us with some pretty amazing experiences, and Lacy J Dalton has had more than her share of those.
I've had some of the most incredible experiences outdoors on the back of a horse that I've ever had in my life. I'll never forget, we were in Bismarck, in one of the Dakotas. Is it North Dakota, Bismarck? Yes, it is. Capital, even. Geez. Anyway, a long time since high school, okay? But I got to meet some cowboys out there, and one of them was a banker, and he had a beautiful horse for me to ride. And we got to go up behind Mount Rushmore, where they feed the eagles. If someone hits an animal on the road, they pick up that roadkill and they take it up behind Mount Rushmore, and they get to feed the eagles with these carcasses. And that was the most incredible experience. First of all, seeing Mount Rushmore, then riding up behind it on just a perfectly magnificent horse. The horse was so well trained and had such beautiful gaits. I felt like I floated all the way there. Some of those things, well, when you're hiking and you're doing all the work yourself, you sometimes get involved in your hips hurting, or you breathe in hard, or and you're climbing up, grabbing onto roots, climbing up a thing. That's great too. But from the back of a horse, it's so much quieter.
My yard glider is my favorite tool. It makes hauling just about anything around the farm easier. Hay, feed, brush, anything. If you haven't seen one of these, Yard Glider is a modern-day stone boat. It loads without lifting, it hauls more, and it dumps faster than a cart. I got my Yard Glider a few months ago, and since then it has helped me move more stuff than I could ever have imagined. I can pull it with the truck or a small riding lawnmower, and I use it every single day. Seriously, every farm and every property should have one. Yard Gliders are made in America, and you can get yours at yardglider.com. Use code HRN and save 10% when you order right now. Now, back to the show. So many of the celebrities I've talked to have mentioned the peace that they find out on the trail, just with them and a horse. And for them, just as it is for the rest of us, trail riding is a nice break from our really busy lives, especially when you can do it with your all-time favorite horse.
I had a little Egyptian Arab horse, uh, whose name was something fancy, but I called him Punk. He went through 4 trainers
Oh my.
who uh, could not get him gentled. They just couldn't get him gentled. He was a very high, hot little horse. You just couldn't wear him out. And finally, my friend, she said, I'd like to use this horse for endurance. I said, well, he sure has it. You won't wear him out. And she said, but first, she said, I have to be able to ride him. I said, well, I said that's going to be a minute because we've had 4 different people work with him and he just isn't having it. He and I got along. We just got along, but the trainers, not so much. But there was a very famous endurance rider up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and they owned a big logging company. And I wish I could think of her name. She actually wrote books about gentling Arab horses, particularly Egyptian Arabs that were so good for endurance. And so my friend took him up to her place and asked her if she would please help us get him trained and gentled. And she said, certainly. She said, go out. So they went out in the corral and they just, used blankets and bags and, flapped stuff around him and threw sheets on him and did stuff like that for about 2 or 3 hours. And then this woman who was in her 80s said, now put the saddle on and a blanket, the pad. And so my friend put the saddle on. She said, now put bridle on. We're going for a ride.
Oh, my goodness.
And she said, you don't want to bore. These horses get bored really easily. And so she took my friend out and they went up and down the mountains out by, they were all the way up on Highway 1, somewhere just south of San Francisco, where it gets to be woods again. And they went up into those steep mountains and rode for about 6 hours. And when they came back, he knew what it was to carry a rider. And he was able to be ridden ever since, from then on. He was always a very high-spirited horse. You couldn't put somebody on him and expect that they would stay on if they hadn't ridden a horse before.
Right. So did he ever do endurance?
He did with her. Yeah, he did. She did some riding with him, but she had to move. And she took him up to Oregon with her for a while. And I used to go up there and ride on the logging roads up in Oregon. And there are mountains up there are very steep too. And literally, he should have been someone's endurance horse because he just, at the end of a 10-hour ride, I would have sold him to you for a penny because he was still doing that little tink, 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 tink. I had this, first, when I first got him, the people that had him before had been endurance people. They had champion endurance horses in California, and they had trained him with some kind of something they had on his head with a metal bar that went kind of up above his nose and this wretched bit. And I finally figured out that myself, I thought, this horse doesn't care about this contraption on his head. He hates it. So I got a side pull, which was a halter with a couple of reins on it.
Right. Yeah, I ride in side pulls all the time.
And he was the same horse with that as he was. Not to say he was a million times better. He wasn't, but he wasn't fighting that miserable headpiece anymore. He absolutely hated it, and it probably hurt him.
Sure.
But he was fine with the side pull. He was just as easy to stop with the side pull as he was the thing. I learned so much about green horses from him, about going over what hated water. Arab horses don't like to get their feet wet, please. Oh God, that's the worst. Well, he was quite a teacher. He was quite a teacher, and I've always appreciated that about him. And we got along with each other. I learned that when he didn't want to go across a creek, that he would either leap across it in one fell swoop, or we would go round and round and round by the side. I would just hold the rein down close to, way down below my knee, and then make him go in circles until he got sick of it. And then he would go through the water. There were little tricks that I learned with him that I don't think he was ever anymore. I don't think he ever became a trained horse because I'm not really a trained rider, but we got along. And I spent hours and hours and hours with him and my dogs up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we kept the trails open. They tell me the trails from Palo Alto, that the trails from Santa Cruz to Palo Alto, which is 70 miles, were open. And so I went up and kept those trails open, at least, probably 20, 30 miles of them for years. Just go up there and he would let me, bring my clippers along and keep the trails open.
Wow.
I don't know if they're open anymore, but they were beautiful. The trails up there through the Madrone and California, Northern California is so beautiful.
Yeah.
People don't know that. They think of California as one long Orange Julius stand. Which it kind of is it kind of is like that in places, but Northern California, I think, is one of the most beautiful places on earth.
That it is. Many years ago, I regularly hauled horses through Northern California, and, well, if you haven't been, put some hiking there on your bucket list. It's certainly worth the trip. Lacy has spent a lot of time around horses, both in the saddle and on the ground, and I was interested to know if the horses had influenced her songwriting and her music in any way.
In that I did a project for the horses called Wild Horse Crossing with a bunch of my friends up here. Everybody donated everything, their performances, the publishing, everything, to make a little CD for the wild horses. And there were 5 or 6 artists on that, along with myself. And I wrote and co-wrote a lot of the songs because I wanted to have this gift that could keep giving. I don't know how many thousands of dollars we've made by selling that CD, but all of the artists, and some of them are really great poets. There's one of the, in particular, a man named Richard Aloyan, who writes the best story songs in the whole world, has a song on there called The Escape that I now do in my show, which is about a Mustang who, is being chased by a helicopter, but he knows the trail and the helicopter doesn't, and he gets away. So it's one of those things where the outlaw gets away, and I always like those stories. I like a happy ending, but 100% of that goes to Let 'em Run, and we don't keep money in Let 'em Run. Our thing is we don't keep money here. Our money comes in, and we give it to the people that need it as soon as we can. I usually try to keep about $3,000 in it just in case we have an emergency where somebody needs to do something quick. But what we do is we try to move that money right on through to help these people who are really boots on the ground, not the great big organizations. They have their own ways of funding themselves. But we like to help the mom and pop groups that really do an enormous amount of the rescue and rehoming and rehabilitation of wild horses. We find that we just did a study recently, and we found that our friend who runs Chili Pepper, which is ChillyPepper.org, probably rehomes and rehabilitates and it moves more horses through than a lot of the very big organizations do. The big organizations are more concerned with legislating and getting things, trying to get things passed to keep the horses safer all the time. And that to some extent that is where probably a great deal of their money goes. And that leaves the mom and pop people who really are doing a lot of the boots on the ground stuff not very well funded sometimes. So those are the groups we like to fund at Let 'em Run, and that's what we do.
Lacy's Let 'em Run Foundation is making a difference. But what about the future? What happens next? And how will our wild horses be protected in years to come? Lacy has an idea of what the possibilities could be, and I was really excited to hear her vision.
We're growing all the time in our ideas about ways to manage them, but we have a friend named Frank Smith who owns the Music Ranch out in Montana, which is just a little way from Livingston, Montana, about 45 miles from Yellowstone Park. He had a wonderful notion that somewhere near Yellowstone Park, it would be wonderful. And we just wrote to the legislators in Wyoming suggesting that they work with the BLM to get some BLM lands given to them to have a wild horse sanctuary. where we use compassionate birth control. I'm sorry, but I have to be a proponent of that. The reason is, if we don't do something, we won't have any left. And that compassionate birth control can be reversed. If you only do it for a few years, up to 6 years, then you can allow the mare to have a baby or 2 babies or however many babies you want. But you can control the size of the herd so they don't, they're like horses are like rabbits. They're just going to have a baby every year. And what we've suggested to the legislature out there is to work with the BLM. They had just had something go through their legislature saying that they wanted to slaughter horses and use the meat, sell the meat. Well, that's never going to happen. Congress is never going to permit that to happen. The American people have made their will very clear about the wild horses. And it is the most explosive issue when you start to get into trying to slaughter horses and send them away for meat. People feel very passionately about it, but we have to do something. And I think that birth control, the compassionate birth control that we have now, but nothing's ideal. I had to use birth control. If I hadn't used birth control, I'd have 27 children by now. Well, they have to use it too. That's how I feel about it. It wasn't my favorite thing, but it's the best we can do for right now. And I think it's a way to control the size of the herd. And if we had way open, and we had some people who really know how to manage horses out there to make sure that they, are safe and that people can interact with them in a non-invasive way with, for instance, Jeep tours and horseback rides, photo safaris, and walking tours. They could also, it would be a wonderful thing to do when you're visiting Yellowstone Park. Let's take the kids and grandma, and we'll put grandma and grandpa in a Jeep. The kids can ride horses, and we'll ride horses, and we'll go out and we'll see these horses and interact with them and see how they are in the wild. And it's a stirring sight. It's just everybody who comes up here to Virginia City, when they see a little herd of wild horses, buses screech to the side of the road, these tourist buses, and the people pour out of them and take pictures of the wild horses. They're fascinating to all of us. Most people really like the wild horses. And it's one of the few things, 80% of the people who've been asked about it believe that they want these horses to be protected and preserved. Well, what better way to do that than preserve them near something like Yellowstone Park that gets 1 million visitors? Is it 1 million, or did we say 5? The last time I looked, it was I think it's
a lot.
It's a lot. They get a lot of visitors. And if they drove past the gate to this on the way, come back and see, wild horses in their natural habitat and the beauty of the West. Come see this. Come experience this. People would come from all over the world.
Well, that's it for this episode. You know by now that we couldn't do this show without the help of a number of people and businesses. So special thanks go to our guest, Lacy J Dalton. Thanks also go to Kurt Webster, Scott Sexton, Jeremy Westby, 2011 PR, Mike Mead, Hands on Gloves, Yard Glider, Jen Hebert, Glenn Hebert, and of course, the Horse Radio Network, now part of the Equine Network family. Many thanks too to Kelly, Jennifer, Mike, Kim, Mary, Allison, and Pat, all who contributed wonderful questions for this episode. And if I missed you, it wasn't intentional, and know that you're thanked as well. Speaking of questions, if you'd like to ask a question of an upcoming celebrity, just go on over to horseradionetwork.com to see who might be coming on next and to send in your questions. As for me, look for me at lisawysocki.com. That's LISAWYSOCKY.com. Tune in next time to meet yet another celebrity who loves horses.